Hoy, de la mano de YUVAL Noah Harari, vamos a intentar repensar el mañana. Vamos a intentar reinventar el futuro e indagar en la búsqueda de un nuevo mundo, de un nuevo modelo social. Todo para convertir al mundo en un lugar más justo, más humano, en el que las herramientas tecnológicas sean unas aliadas indispensables. No podemos ni queremos cerrar los ojos a la realidad del mundo en que vivimos y tampoco del mundo que dicen que se viene. Pero aquí en nuestros encuentros de Amigos por Israel, sí declararnos tecno-optimistas. Todavía podemos diseñar el futuro, todavía estamos a tiempo, todavía estamos en un mundo en construcción. De todo esto vamos a hablar con un invitado excepcional, el historiador y escritor israelí YUVAL Noah Harari. Lo hemos leído, hemos seguido sus intervenciones y ahora vamos a tener la oportunidad de leer uno de sus grandes libros, el bestseller Sapiens en versión cómics. Sapiens, una novela gráfica que tiene al propio YUVAL Noah Harari como narrador convertido en un alter ego dibujado. Hoy es nuestro invitado de honor en Amigos por Israel, el escritor e historiador israelí YUVAL Noah Harari. Su sueño y su objetivo es conseguir que las grandes ideas sean accesibles para todos. Acaba de publicar un nuevo libro, Sapiens, una historia gráfica, una adaptación radical de su libro en formato novela gráfica y narrada en versión dibujo de Harari, otra versión de él mismo. YUVAL Harari, Erev Tov, Toda Rabba lekabel otanu, Bishvilanu ze hakavod meod ledaber itcha. Toda Rabba, od pam YUVAL.
Thank you for inviting me.
Señor Harari, nos gustaría saber cómo surgió esta idea de convertir Sapiens en una novela gráfica.
I was looking for new ways to reach new audiences, to make science accessible to more people. And then these two artists, Daniel and David, they approached me with the idea of producing a graphic novel together. And I really liked it. I really liked their ideas. And we collaborated on this project. It was, I think, the most fun project I ever worked on. I couldn't do it myself. I don't know how to draw. I draw like a 5-year-old kid. And they had so many ideas how to do it. So, they suggested, let's do this chapter like a detective movie. The story of how humans caused the extermination of most of the big animals of the planet. Let's do it like a whodunit mystery. We'll have a Detective Lopez, and she goes around the world investigating these serial killers who is killing all the big animals. And then they had this idea of telling the evolution of the different human species, because Homo sapiens is not the only human species. You have Neanderthals and you have the dwarf species from Flores Island. So let's do this as a reality TV show. You have all the different species competing who is the winner of the reality TV show of evolution. And it was a lot of fun to basically break all the academic conventions of how you write a normal history book or normal science book and try these different things.
Como bien dices, hay muchas formas distintas de contar una historia y de explicar la ciencia. Con esta novela gráfica vuelves a romper nuevamente las convenciones académicas. ¿Cómo te hace sentir esto? ¿Qué parte de ese proceso ha sido con la que más has disfrutado?
I think it's really, for me, the fun was about learning new ways to tell the old stories and also dealing with questions that I could previously just ignore. When you write a text, you ignore so much. Like you write that Neanderthals had sex with Sapiens. And this is something we know now scientifically, that there were fertile sexual relations between Sapiens and Neanderthals, something like 40, 50,000 years ago. So you and me and everybody who sees us now probably have some Neanderthal DNA in their body. Now, when you write it, you don't have to imagine how they actually look like. But when you draw it in a graphic novel, you have to decide many things. So first of all, who is it a Sapiens man and a Neanderthal woman, or is it the other way around? And what is their skin color? And what is their hair color? And what kind of hairstyle they have? Now, in a text, if you don't want to engage with these questions, you just ignore it. But in a graphic novel, you can't draw a general human who has no gender and no skin color and no hairstyle. So you have to go back to the scientific literature and investigate. What do we know about these questions? Do we know whether it was Sapiens men with Neanderthal women or the other way around? And do we know how they actually looked like? So actually we do. We know that Neanderthals, probably at least some of them, had lighter skin color and hair color than Sapiens who came from Africa. So it was, for me, a kind of big surprise to realize that all these things that I've been talking about and writing about for many years, actually, when you have to draw them, you have to go back to square one and do your research again.
Tu objetivo se centra en suscitar intereses de los lectores que normalmente no se interesan por la ciencia y la historia. ¿Cómo lo haces? ¿Por qué no es un objetivo fácil?
First of all, you need to remember that most people think in stories, not in numbers or statistics or models. When professors at the university argue, then they usually, like the big weapons are the numbers, the statistics, the graphs, all these things. But it doesn't work with the general public. It's too boring, frankly. So you need to find a way how to translate it into a story, into a narrative, which would be captivating and interesting, and do it without abandoning scientific accuracy. I mean, if you abandon scientific accuracy, then it's much easier. Of course, you can invent anything you want, but then you miss the main point. Then you're just, more fake news. So how to find this balance of still being loyal to the values of science and accuracy and facts, and nevertheless manage to wrap it up in an interesting way. And what makes it difficult is very often there is no agreement among scientists. There are discussions, there are disagreements. So how do you convey that? And one of the methods we use, we have several characters of scientists in the book, and they sometimes argue. And they sometimes have discussions. And this, again, makes it fun because it's human interaction. It's not something cold and distant that you write, well, there is one theory that says X and there is another theory that says Y. No, you create these funny scientists who have a particular way of talking and they look in a particular way and they're arguing with each other. And this is much more interesting.
¿Debemos volver la vista atrás para entender el mundo actual, para comprender el panorama en su conjunto?
Certainly, almost anything you want to understand, you have to go back in time, whether it's, again, gender relations. I mean, so many of the arguments today about gender and sex in the 21st century, they are based on what we think is natural for Homo sapiens, for our species. But the thing is, who knows how families looked like 50,000 years ago? Who knows what sexual relations were like 50,000 years ago? People assume that there was always this traditional family. One man, one woman, 2.5 kids, a dog. This was always the case. And it's obviously not so. When you look at biology, you don't see a single family structure among all our ape relatives. Gibbons are the only ones who have these kind of long-term monogamous relationships. Among common chimpanzees, you have more of a hippie commune. There are very few long-term relationships between just two individuals. Among bonobo chimpanzees, it's the females who actually dominate society, and lesbian relations between females are extremely important. And gorillas have another structure. They have there, you have one male with a huge harem of many females. Now, which of these models is most similar to ancient humans? We are not sure. Again, we go to anthropology and we see a lot of different family structures. We go to archaeology, okay, forget about all this. Let's find direct evidence. How did families look like 50,000 years ago? There is almost no evidence. We have a lot of evidence from 50,000 years ago. We have stone tools, but they don't tell us about family relations. We have cave art. You would have expected, you would have hoped that somewhere in Altamira or Lascaux, in one of these caves, you would have a family picture. There is none. They draw elephants and mammoths and bears and horses, everything, no families. There are a few human figures. It's not utterly that they didn't paint humans, they did draw humans, they never drew images that we can say, look, that's a family. Why not? What does it tell us? So this is obvious how relevant this is to the discussions today about gender. It's the same if you think about epidemics, which are now, like everywhere in the news. And it's interesting to realize that epidemics actually didn't exist in the Stone Age. Epidemics began with the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago. Because most infectious diseases that we suffer from, they came from domesticated animals, from chickens and pigs and cows and so forth. Hunter-gatherers in the Stone Age didn't have any domesticated animals. And even if they caught a virus from a wild animal, like some bat, transferred a coronavirus to a hunter-gatherer 50,000 years ago, it would not have caused an epidemic because people lived in small mobile groups, 20 people, 50 people moving around. So maybe if you got ill, you could infect 10 other people, maybe the whole band. All 50 people got infected, let's say 12 died, and that was it, that was over. You start seeing epidemics only when people settle down in villages and towns and cities with trade networks, and then you start seeing that a disease that starts in one place spreads and infects and kills millions of people. So even to understand something like COVID, it's a good idea to know something about life in the Stone Age.
¿Cómo explicás en esta novela gráfica una de las características del Homo Sapiens? Es que nosotros, si es que puedo decir nosotros, nos consideramos los más inteligentes del planeta. ¿Podría ser esa una de nuestras mayores debilidades?
Yes, we tend to overestimate our abilities and our wisdom in many ways. In fact, what makes us so powerful, what makes us the dominant species on the planet, is not our individual genius. As an individual, a human being is not superior to a chimpanzee or a Neanderthal or a pig or even a dog. If you leave me alone on some island with a chimpanzee, I think the chimpanzee will do much better than me. What really makes us powerful is the ability to cooperate in very large numbers. We today have a trade network of almost 8 billion people. Chimpanzees can cooperate, maybe 50 chimpanzees, 100 chimpanzees, nothing more than that. And what makes it possible for us to cooperate in very large numbers is not our intelligence, it's our imagination, it's our ability to invent and believe in fictional stories. Many of them are not true at all. It doesn't matter. If you have 1 million people that believe in the same story, even if the story is a ridiculous conspiracy theory, it doesn't matter. If they all believe the same story, they are able to cooperate effectively, to follow the same rules, to follow the same laws, and this is our superpower. In the graphic novel, we personify this. We created this image of a superhero in Dr. Fiction, and she personifies this human superpower to create and spread and believe fictional stories. And, it's even, forget about religion. which is like the obvious example. If you look at economics, even today, our economy is based on fictional stories. Corporations, for example, Google, Facebook, Tesla, all these corporations, they are just what lawyers call a legal fiction. The only place they exist is in the stories we invented and tell each other. And it's the same with money. Money is not an objective reality. It's not like bananas that have actual value. You can eat them and sustain your body. Money today is, you have these colorful pieces of paper. And even this is quite rare. 95% of money in the world today is not even pieces of paper. It's just electronic data in computers. During the COVID crisis, the EU and the United States and China and many other countries, they created trillions of euros and dollars and yens out of nothing. They didn't even bother to print dollars or euros. They just go into the computer, they add a zero somewhere, and a trillion euros emerge out of nothing. It works as long as everybody believes it. That I can go to a supermarket. I don't even carry a wallet with me. I just pass this credit card, and what it does is it transfers some bits of information from one file in the computer to another file in the computer, and the person gives me bananas that I can eat. This is absolutely amazing. Chimpanzees will never be able to do it. And it's not because we are smart, it's because we are willing to believe these fantastic stories that lawyers and priests and economists tell us. It's basically the same principle.
La cooperación es nuestro superpoder como seres humanos, pero ¿crees que nuestras instituciones y nuestros gobiernos se han olvidado de ella en esta vorágine causada por la pandemia?
It depends on your perspective. During COVID, we see in many countries a dangerous weakening of trust in institutions. And this is also the result of politicians in previous years that deliberately, as a political strategy, undermined trust in the media, in the academy, in the authorities of the state. And now we see how dangerous it is, because the entire system runs on trust. Everything, our entire world is built on trust between strangers. As hunter-gatherers 50,000 years ago, you lived in a very small band. You actually knew everybody around all the other people. So you trusted individuals that you knew. In the modern world, we trust impersonal institutions, and we cooperate with billions of strangers. And if that trust disappears, the entire world will collapse. The whole human civilization will collapse. Luckily, I think we are still in a relatively good situation. It may not look like it from the news, but we have more trust today and we cooperate better today than in almost any previous time in human history. Certainly more than 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, there was no global currency like the dollar that people everywhere trusted. In the Middle Ages, when the Black Death spread from China to Britain, there was no trust in common scientific and medical institutions. There was no data shared between people in China and people in India and people in Europe. Everybody tried to do their own thing, and nobody succeeded. Nobody in the world understood what was causing millions of people to die. We now have the scientific institutions, and even though we saw a lot of attacks on them in recent years, both from politicians and from all these conspiracy theories, there is still an amazing amount of trust. We saw it in April, that when the scientists recommended to close down all the churches in Easter, even the Pope followed the recommendation of the scientists. It said to people, don't come to church, stay at home. and he conducted this online mass in an empty Vatican. So, in the Middle Ages, people didn't know what was happening. They thought it was punishment from God. So everybody ran to the churches to pray, and this increased the infection, of course. Now, even the church has so much trust in scientific institutions that when the scientists say close down the church, they do it. So I think we are in a better situation. There is still a lot to do. We are far from perfect. But we are in a better situation than probably in any previous time in human history.
Estamos en una situación mejor también porque ahora nos damos cuenta de la importancia de disponer de una buena educación científica al alcance de todos. Pero desafortunadamente solemos olvidar las lecciones aprendidas. ¿Crees que en un futuro próximo le otorgaremos a la ciencia y a la educación científica el crédito que se merecen?
In this crisis, everybody now realizes the importance of understanding epidemics, understanding what viruses are, how to stop them. And I hope that when the crisis is over, we will carry the same kind of attitude towards other problems like climate change and ecological collapse. That the same way that we now look up to the doctors and the epidemiologists to explain what is happening and what should we do, later on, and yeah, of course, even now we can start, but later on, when this crisis is over, we'll also listen to the climate scientists when they warn us about what's happening around the world.
Hace 2 años atrás escribiste: olvidémonos de la programación. Lo mejor que podemos enseñarle a los niños es a reinventarse. Tengo la sensación de que esta cita es ahora más cierta que nunca. ¿Qué opinás?
Yeah, things are speeding up. We expected previously that the radical changes in the job market will take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But COVID is accelerating it. That so many things are being automatized, digitalized, moved online. Entire industries are collapsing or disappearing. When the crisis is over, some jobs will go back to normal, but a lot of jobs will disappear. They will not come back. Now, there will be new jobs. I don't believe that we'll just see the elimination of jobs and humans will have nothing to do. There is almost always will be new jobs. The big problem is to have the skills necessary for these new jobs. And because we don't know in advance, we don't know how the job market would look like in 2040. We can't teach kids today the skills they will need in 2040. What we can do is give them the ability to keep learning and retraining and reinventing themselves, because this is the one thing they will absolutely need in the 21st century. And it's also vital to realize is that we are not facing a single revolution. It's not like there'll be the big AI revolution of 2025 when lots of jobs just disappear, a lot of other jobs are created. We have like 5 difficult years or 10 difficult years. People have to retrain, find new jobs, and eventually everything calms down. And we have a different job market. It won't be at all like this, because AI is nowhere near its full potential. By 2025, there will be big changes as many jobs are automated, but AI will continue to improve. There are many things it can't do in 2025, but will be able to do in 2035. So all kinds of jobs that remained safe in the first wave of automation, they will disappear in the second wave or the third wave. And even some of the new jobs will change or vanish. And again, there will be new jobs even after that. But you will have to retrain and reinvent yourself again and again. And this will be a huge financial burden. You don't have a job, you need to spend a year retraining. Who is supporting you in the meantime? It will be an even bigger psychological burden. Because to think that you have to start again and again at age 40, again at age 50, again at age 60, many people will find it extremely difficult psychologically. It's stressful. So we will need a lot of support from governments in both financially, but also psychologically, to help people live in such a hectic way. And my biggest fear is that this will create a huge inequality in the world. Some countries will benefit enormously from the automation revolution. They will become even richer than they are now, and they will have the resources to support and retrain their population. So they will continue to become even wealthier. Every revolution will make them even more powerful. And then other countries will remain behind. They won't have the resources to retrain their workforce in the first wave of the automation revolution. And then they will become even poorer and weaker. So obviously they will not be able to deal with the second and third waves. So we'll see the world splitting. In the 20th century, there was a convergence. You had the industrial powers of the 19th century, like Britain and France and the USA and Japan. And you had the developing countries. And gradually the developing countries caught up with the leading industrial powers. China and India caught up with the United States and Britain. And what enabled them to catch up is cheap manual labor. This was their main asset. We don't have educated people. We don't have complex industrial facilities. We have a lot of cheap manual labor. That's our ticket to progress. In the 21st century, cheap manual labor is becoming irrelevant. It's the easiest thing to automate, all the workers in the textile factories. So we might see a growing divergence as some countries like the USA or like China will become immensely rich and powerful. They will lead this new AI revolution, and other countries will remain completely behind, will maybe face economic collapse and political domination.
Ahora nos dicen que tenemos que aprender a vivir con el coronavirus. Así que está claro que necesitamos cierta capacidad de adaptación y resiliencia. En cierto modo, la capacidad de adaptación y la resiliencia fueron las habilidades que permitieron prosperar al Homo Sapiens. Quizás no estamos tan lejos.
Yeah, as a species, we are extremely adaptable and resilient. So this is why there is hope. I mean, not everything is lost. I think we can adapt to the new realities of COVID, and we can adapt to the new conditions of the 21st century. The problem is that humans, in the process of adaptation, they often take some time and experimentation. You know, if you think about the previous big revolution, the Industrial Revolution, ultimately, we learned how to use the forces, the powers of modern industry to benefit most humans. So the average person today, even in poor countries, enjoys better healthcare, more food, better life than the average person before the Industrial Revolution. But in the middle, we had a learning process. People did all kinds of experiments how to build industrial societies, and some of these experiments are absolutely horrifying. You had Nazi Germany, you had the Soviet Union, you had the two world wars, the Holocaust, imperialism. All these were in a way experiments in how to build an industrial society. And eventually we learned what to avoid and what is the best way. But we can't afford any more failed experiments in the 21st century. If we have a third world war with the technology we have today, we won't survive it. And if somebody comes up with a new totalitarian system, this time, not like Hitler, based on trains and radio, but a new totalitarian system for the 21st century, based on artificial intelligence and bioengineering, this would be far, far worse than anything Hitler or Stalin or Franco did. And we just can't afford such failed experiments. So we have to get it right from the beginning And for that, we need some kind of global cooperation on this. And this is very difficult because at present, you see less and less cooperation between different countries.
Actualmente estamos saturados de tanta información y como bien decís, la gente necesita las habilidades necesarias para darle sentido a todos estos datos porque a veces hay demasiada. ¿Cómo podemos saber en qué o en quién confiar?
The key is to trust in institutions, not in individual people. Nobody can know everything. Most of what I know about the Stone Age or about the 20th century, it's from the research of other people. And why do I trust this research? Because I don't know the people who wrote the books and articles. I trust the institutions, the universities, the academic journals, the scientific conferences. And I think, therefore, it's important to build good institutions. It's the same with the media. You can't just go and search information online about current events. How do you know who to trust? You can't go personally and see everything that is happening or interview the journalist who wrote it. So ultimately, it's about which journals do you trust, which TV stations. So we need to build good institutions in different fields, medicine, science, the media, because ultimately this is the guarantee of receiving good and reliable information. And, I would say that the main problem with all these fake news and conspiracy theories that are spreading is that they simplify the world too much. People, and I'm also included, we are lazy. We don't like to think too much. We don't like to think too hard. So when somebody comes along with a simple theory that explains everything, it's very tempting because it saves us a lot of time and effort. You think that there is just this group of people, billionaires or Freemasons or whoever, who sit in some secret room and they control everything. If you believe that, then everything becomes simple. Like the war in Syria, you don't need to study Middle Eastern politics. It's just part of their conspiracy to take over the world. And 5G technology, you don't even need to understand what it means, 5G. What is 5G? You don't need to know anything about the technology. You just this is another part of the big conspiracy. And COVID-19, it wasn't a virus from a bat. It was again part of the conspiracy. So this is a sign of danger. When you have something that simplifies the world so much, be careful. Because, from your own personal experience, the world is complicated. You try to control 10 people in your family. You try to organize a birthday party. You try to, you're on the school board of your local school. How difficult it is to get 50 people to do something. So you think that 10 billionaires in some room, they can control the whole world, 8 billion people? That's crazy. That's impossible. So be careful about things that simplify reality too much. That's one sign of danger. Another sign of danger is people who know everything. That, as a scientist, for me, one of the signals that this is science is that there is areas of ignorance that we don't know. That, you look at the Stone Age and you ask, what was family structure like 50,000 years ago? We don't know. We are still working on it. We're still researching it. When somebody comes with this kind of complete theory which explains everything, this is usually a religion or a cult or a conspiracy theory. These are the people who usually refuse to admit ignorance.
Déjame que te diga algo acerca del coronavirus. La tormenta pasará, pero las decisiones que tomemos ahora podrían cambiar nuestras vidas en los próximos años. ¿Debemos actuar con rapidez? Tú escribiste eso hace unos pocos meses. ¿Qué tal lo estamos haciendo?
It depends. In some ways we are doing okay. Scientifically we have managed to understand. We now understand the epidemic far better. than at the beginning. I'm confident that we have now all the scientific knowledge we need in order to overcome the epidemic. I don't know how. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, but as a historian, when I look at it and I compare it to previous epidemics like AIDS or like the big flu epidemic of 1918 or the Black Death, I think we are doing much better now. In other fields, there is a lot of reason to be worried because you don't see global cooperation on things like a global economic plan. Economically, the big storm is still ahead of us. You know, countries are spending trillions of money like there is no tomorrow, but tomorrow will come. We are headed towards a very big economic crisis. Again, in some countries worse than in others. And it's a global crisis, and you don't see any global plan of action. There is no leadership. The impression is that there are no adults in the room. You don't see the G7 or the G20 or anybody coming with a global plan. Again, this is most worrying about poor developing countries that just don't have the resources to cope with this crisis. I'm not so worried about the USA or Germany or Japan. They'll be okay somehow. But many countries could completely collapse. And we don't see the kind of global cooperation that we could have. Because again, we are not in the Middle Ages. We have immense knowledge and power. We just seem not to have the political wisdom how to use this power.
Yuval, ¿y qué hay de Europa? ¿Cómo crees que están lidiando allí con la crisis esta y con la crisis económica que se avecina? ¿Y qué nos aguarda en el futuro?
Again, I think Europe is doing relatively okay, everything considered. Especially as some people admire, China about the efficient way it dealt with the epidemic. I admire Europe for the balanced way that it manages to keep democratic values, it manages to keep the human rights and freedom of citizens, even in the midst of a pandemic. And that's very important because, the pandemic isn't everything. There are other important things in life that we have to balance them against the pandemic. I think the main thing about the European Union is that Europeans really need to decide what they want from the European Union. They need to align their expectations with their powers of the European Union. People on the one hand complain that the EU is not doing enough, and at the other time they complain that the EU has too much power. So you need to decide. One thing is to say, well, we don't want a strong European Union. We want it to remain a very loose organization of completely independent countries, in which case you can't expect the EU to do much in a crisis like COVID. If the EU remains a weak conglomerate of countries, then in a time of a severe crisis like COVID, it goes back to the national governments. They are the only ones that can deal with it. On the other hand, Europeans can decide, no, we want a strong European Union that will be able to deal effectively on a collective level with a crisis like COVID. And that's fine, but that means you need to give up a lot of the powers of national governments and transfer it to the EU. To give an example, medical equipment. So you could say, okay, we don't want to rely on medicines or masks produced in China or India, because in a time of crisis, maybe they block the shipments. Now, you can have a European system of producing medical equipment, which would be a very good idea. It will save a lot of redundancies. Instead of 27 countries, each establishing its own local production, you can have a European production of essential medical equipment. But for this to work in a crisis, the European Union needs the power to decide where the equipment goes. If there is, let's say, a factory in Germany, and the European Union decides, okay, now ship masks or medicines to Spain, the German government can't have a veto right. No, this is in our national territory. We want the equipment to ourselves, so we stop the shipment. If you do that, then obviously Spain would like to have factories on its own territory, and Portugal would want the same, and Italy would want the same. And then you are back to 27 different. So you need to decide. I think politicians should be frank with the voters. They should come to the voters, to the citizens, and tell them, look, this is the choice, what kind of European Union you want, and align your expectations with the actual powers of the Union.
Tal como lo has escrito, la humanidad debe elegir entre la unidad o la solidaridad mundial, y a veces me da la sensación de que ya hemos elegido. No sé, ¿qué opinas al respecto? ¿Y qué puede hacer el ciudadano común?
I think it's not too late. I mean, we have seen forces of disunity becoming stronger in the world in the recent years, but it's not deterministic, it's not inevitable. We can change direction. I think the most important thing to realize is that there is no contradiction between nationalism and globalism, between national loyalty and global solidarity and global cooperation. Some politicians tell people that there is a contradiction. You have to decide. You have to choose nationalism and reject globalism. But that's a complete mistake. There is no contradiction there, because nationalism is not about hating foreigners. Nationalism is about loving your compatriots and caring about them. And there are many situations when, in order to take good care of your compatriots, you must cooperate with foreigners. And an epidemic is an obvious example. You know, if the Germans now develop a vaccine, it will be crazy of Spanish patriots to say, no, we don't want a foreign German vaccine. We are waiting until we have a patriotic Spanish vaccine invented by Spanish scientists, and only then we take it. It's ridiculous. So we don't need really to make this choice. You can have both. The same way you can be loyal to your family and loyal to your profession and loyal to your country at the same time. You know, sometimes there are conflicts, and sometimes you prefer this, sometimes you prefer that. But people have, they are not kind of monolith. They have at the same time different identities. It's the same. You can be loyal to your country and cooperate with other countries about common interests. You know, global warming, you can't stop it on a national level. Nuclear war, you can't prevent it just by your country doing something. You're thinking about the AI revolution which is coming. To regulate artificial intelligence would be impossible on a national level. It doesn't matter what the Spanish government decides to regulate AI. If the Chinese or the Americans are doing something else, then very soon the Spanish also will have to break their own regulations, because nobody would like to stay behind. If you think in terms of, let's say, weapons, producing autonomous weapon systems, killer robots. Now, you can ban killer robots in Spain. You can ban killer robots in the whole of Europe. But what happens if the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans and the Israelis are speeding along, producing better and better killer robots, until the moment comes when the generals of the Spanish army and the German army and whatever come to the government and says, look, there's been a military revolution. Our army is absolutely useless. If we don't go into the game of killer robots, you can give us swords and bows and arrows, it will be the same. So obviously the Europeans will have to do the same. The only way to regulate these kinds of technologies if you have some kind of global cooperation, and it's not too late to have this kind of global cooperation.
No es demasiado tarde. Es un gran mensaje. Centrémonos brevemente en la privacidad. ¿Podría una pandemia mundial como esta impulsar el establecimiento de una especie de gran hermano biométrico? ¿Te preocupa este tema ahora más que hace un año atrás?
Much more concerned. You know, I had this idea that we will have a big battle in the 21st century between health and privacy, and health is likely to win. People will give up their privacy, but it's now happening much, much faster than was expected. And, you know, we need surveillance to fight the epidemic. I'm not against it, but we should be extremely careful about it because it can also serve as the basis for the worst authoritarian regime that ever existed. You know, if you have mass biometric surveillance, that means that for the first time in history, somebody can follow everybody all the time and know not only what they do and what they buy and who they meet, they know what you feel. If now, you know, people are now watching our conversation online. Now, let's say you have a biometric bracelet on your arm that is constantly monitoring your blood pressure, your heart rate, your brain activity. This data means that somebody can know not only that you are watching this conversation online, they know how you feel every moment, because feelings, emotions, they are biological phenomena, just like disease, just like fever. The same technology that can tell some central authority that you now have 38 temperature and you have all the signs, the biological signs of COVID, you have COVID, the same technology in principle can tell this authority that you are now angry or you are bored or you think it's all nonsense. No, this is all science fiction, it will never happen. So what kind of power that means? You know, every corporation in the world and every dictator in the world would like to have this technology. So the question is, how do we employ the technology for good to fight epidemics, for example? Because, you know, if you have this kind of system, everybody wears a biometric bracelet 24 hours a day that monitors your body, no more epidemics, not just COVID, but you stop all the epidemics, flu. The moment somebody gets flu, immediately the bracelet picks up the signs of flu and you're isolated, and that's it, no more flu. So the potential for good is enormous, but the potential for evil, for building the worst totalitarian regime in history, is also enormous. So how do we benefit without falling victim to the dystopian scenarios? That's the big question of our era.
Estamos llegando al final de nuestra charla, pero quería preguntarte algo relacionado con la ecología, porque la crisis del coronavirus nos ha mostrado el poder de la naturaleza y sin embargo resulta paradójico. Parece que nos hemos olvidado de la ecología, del calentamiento global y del cambio climático. ¿Crees que es así?
Yeah, it's still all around us. It didn't go anywhere. These problems are just getting worse and worse every day. As I said earlier, I hope that COVID will serve as a kind of wake-up call to humanity. First of all, that we need to listen to the scientists more, but also that we are still animals. We are still part of the ecological system. And, you know, in a way, nature has, you can say, has been kind to us. It, first of all, threw a very simple ball in our direction. COVID-19, as epidemics go, is a relatively mild epidemic. It's nothing like the Black Death. It's nothing like, I don't know, AIDS, which killed almost everybody was infected with AIDS in the 1980s, died. And so kind of nature is reminding us, look what can happen from a relatively mild virus coming from a bat. Now, there are much, much worse things that are in store for us if we don't deal with the ecological problem. If you think that COVID is bad, then a complete collapse of the ecological system, it's far, far worse. So I hope that this crisis will in the end be a good thing, that it serves kind of a wake-up call to humanity, do something before it's too late.
Muchísimas gracias, Yuval Noah Harari, por estar con nosotros en esta interesantísima entrevista para Amigos por Israel. Hemos aprendido muchísimo de tus reflexiones y recuerden, queridos amigos, que eso es lo que en este grupo buscamos.